All right, guys, so there was a Supreme Court decision that came down the other day that is not getting nearly as much coverage as Roe versus Wade. Now, I understand Roe versus Wade is, that's like probably the most well-known Supreme Court case, so it should get a lot of coverage, don't get me wrong. I just wish that this story was also getting at least more coverage than it's currently getting. So this is in the AP News. Supreme Court backs coach in praying on field after games. So let me walk you through this. We'll read some of the article. We'll give you all the facts, and then I'll break down for you the decision and the implication of the decision, because that's actually the more important thing here. The Supreme Court said Monday that a high school football coach who knelt and prayed on the field after games was protected by the Constitution, a decision that opponents said would open the door to much more coercive prayer in public schools. So there was a case way back in the day where, the Supreme Court said in public schools you can't open the day with a prayer. You can't do that. We have separation of church and state. We have the Establishment Clause, which says that the state cannot establish a religion. So if you're standing up there doing a Christian prayer, okay, what about the Muslims out there? What about the Buddhists? What about the Hindus? What about the atheists? What about the agnostics? What about people who just don't want to do it? The public school needs to effectively represent everybody, and you can't have a particular prayer being said at the beginning. It's not the job of the government. It's not the job of the school to do that. So that was clear. You just can't do prayer in school. Now, this is given the facts of this case, it gets into a more gray area, and this right-wing Supreme Court used that gray area to justify rolling back precedent, which might have more far-reaching effects. So again, let's continue here. The court ruled 6-3 for the coach, with the conservative justices in the majority and the liberals in dissent. The case was the latest in a line of rulings for religious plaintiffs. The case forced the justices to wrestle with how to balance the religious and free speech rights of teachers and coaches with the rights of students not to feel pressured into participating in religious practices. So they see the dilemma here as is this more of a free speech thing where, you let the coach or whatever have their free speech rights, or is this more of a separation of church and state thing where the government or the school is sort of imposing religion on the kids? All right, again, let's continue. The liberal justices in the minority said there was evidence that Bremerton, Washington high school coach Joseph Kennedy's prayers at the 50-yard line had a coercive effect on students and allowed him to incorporate his personal religious beliefs into a school event. Dissenting Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote that the decision set us further down a perilous path in forcing states to entangle themselves with religion. But the justices in the majority emphasized that the coach's prayers came after the games were over and at a time when he wasn't responsible for students and was free to do other things. The coach and his attorneys at First Liberty Institute, a Christian legal group, were among those cheering the decision. Kennedy said in an interview that his first reaction was one of pure joy. Quote, "Just like in all my football games, I just threw my arms up, touchdown," he said. He described the 7 years since the dispute began as tough on his family, but absolutely worth it. Justice Neil Gorsuch, writing for the majority in the ruling, declared, "The Constitution and the best of our traditions counsel mutual respect and tolerance, not censorship and suppression, for religious and non-religious views alike." Gorsuch noted that the coach prayed during a period when school employees were free to speak with a friend, call for a reservation at a restaurant, check email, or attend to other personal matters, and while his students were otherwise occupied. "It would be wrong to treat everything public school teachers and coaches say and do as speech subject to government control," he wrote. "If that were the case, a school could fire a Muslim teacher for wearing a headscarf in the classroom or prohibit a Christian aide from praying quietly over her lunch in the cafeteria." Now, look, when you talk about these examples that are given, do we all agree that a Muslim school teacher should be allowed to wear a headscarf because that's their religion and they're not imposing it on anybody else? Yeah, I think that makes sense. Should a Christian aide be able to pray quietly over their lunch in the lunchroom? Yeah, I think that's allowed. I think these are Weasley comparisons to make, though, because that's really not what was going on in this case. He didn't, at the end of the games, go to the 50-yard line and stand there in silent prayer where he's praying to himself. That's not what happened at all. In fact, the facts are pretty much polar opposite of that. He would go to the 50-yard line. He would take a knee. There were times he would hold up a helmet. There'd be people who gather around him from his team and the other team, and he would very loudly deliver a prayer. It was very clearly like a public prayer with the purpose of trying to bring in other people to engage in the prayer. So to bring these examples up is kind of Weasley, because these aren't the facts of the case that we're talking about. I think we all agree on the facts of this particular case, but what this guy was doing was different. Okay, more. He closed by writing that respect for religious expressions is indispensable to life in a free and diverse republic, whether those expressions take place in a sanctuary or on a field, and whether they manifest through the spoken word or a bowed head. The decision, I don't know why I'm struggling with that. The decision continues a pattern in which the court has ruled in favor of religious plaintiffs. Last week, the court ruled that Maine can't exclude religious schools from a program that offers tuition aid for private education, a decision that could ease religious organizations' access to taxpayer money. Wow. Now, that, I think, is even more controversial than this case. So if they're saying tax money now has to go to religious private schools in the same way it goes to secular private schools, that is definitely a violation of separation of church and state. Because by definition, you're giving tax money to a religious institution. You can't do that. You can't do that at all. Should we give tax money to madrasas? What are we talking about here? That was a wantonly, brazenly unconstitutional act to have. That one is actually even more over the top than this current case that we're discussing. So there's a pattern here, guys, and the pattern is encroaching more and more religion into the public sphere, into the government sphere. In dissent, Sotomayor wrote Monday that players recognize that gaining the coach's approval may pay dividends, small and large, from extra playing time to a stronger letter of recommendation to additional support in college athletic recruiting. And she said, some students reported joining Kennedy's prayer because they felt social pressure to follow their coach and teammates. Wow. Sotomayor was joined in her dissent by Justices Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan. Paul Clement, the attorney who argued the case on behalf of Kennedy, said in a statement that the decision would allow the coach to finally return to the place he belongs, coaching football and quietly praying by himself after the game. Okay, so now this was more of like a dry, just retelling of the facts of the case for you. That's what the Associated Press article is. Now, this article that I'm about to show you now is a much more biting criticism of the decision here. And I want to give you some of this too, so you can, form your own opinion on it. I'll tell you guys my opinion here at the end or as we go along. The Supreme Court hands the religious right a big victory by lying about the facts of the case. This is the thing that stuck out to me too. The way that Gorsuch acted like the situations unfolded, it's not how it unfolded. It wasn't the reality. So he had to sort of fudge it in order to make the decision that he made. Kennedy versus Bremerton School District is a big victory for the religious right, but only because Gorsuch misrepresents the facts of the case. The Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision in Kennedy versus Bremerton School District on Monday, overruling a 1971 case laying out how the government must keep its distance from religion. But Justice Neil Gorsuch's opinion for himself and his fellow Republican appointees relies on a bizarre misrepresentation of the case facts. He repeatedly claims that Joseph Kennedy, a former public school football coach at Bremerton High School in Washington State who ostentatiously prayed at the 50-yard line following football games, often joined by his players, members of the opposing team, and members of the general public, offered his prayers quietly while his students were otherwise occupied. Again, that's the key here. Because if those were the facts, you get this coach who, it's after the game, everybody's scattering, people are going to their cars, they're going home, etc. He stands at the 50-yard line and, prays to himself in quiet, then this isn't a Supreme Court case. Everybody would agree. Of course he's allowed to do that. But that's not what he was doing. He was leading a prayer in the same way that you would lead a prayer before the game. He was leading a prayer after the game, purposely getting the students around him. And the ones who didn't want to join felt pressure to join. And again, this is a public school employee. He's a representative of the government while in his capacity at this job. That's very clearly what he's doing. But they have all these Weasley ways to get around it. Well, technically the game was over, so isn't he kind of off the clock? Well, it depends. What is he doing? If the game is over, but some kid is injured and he's helping the kid who's injured, then he's doing his official capacity as a coach. If he's talking to the parents of the kids, well, he's talking as a coach, as a representative of the school district, as a representative of the government. If you go and pray at the 50-yard line and you're making a big show of it, that's not just you as any old private citizen who just came out of the stands to do that. That's you as a coach. So again, very, very, very Weasley. Because Gorsuch misrepresents the facts of this case, it's hard to assess many of its implications. The court's decision to explicitly overrule Lemon versus Kurtzman, the 1971 decision that previously governed cases involving the Constitution's language prohibiting an establishment of religion, has obvious implications for future lawsuits. Lower court judges will no longer apply Lemon's framework to Establishment Clause cases. This is very important. This is very important here. But it's not clear how those lower court judges should now navigate a question about the separation of church and state. Although the court overrules Lemon, it does not announce a fleshed-out test that will replace Lemon. Instead, Kennedy announces a vague new rule that the Establishment Clause must be interpreted by reference to historical practices and understandings. What does that even mean? Moreover, because Gorsuch's opinion relies so heavily on false facts, the court does not actually decide what the Constitution has to say about a coach who ostentatiously prays in the presence of students and the public. Instead, it decides a fabricated case about a coach who merely engaged in private and quiet prayer. So you see the problem here? Everybody agrees private prayer, is fine. Quiet prayer is fine. But if it's loud prayer, if it's leading prayer, if it's you acting in your role as a public school teacher and representative of the government, you can't do that. You can't do that. And that's really what he was doing, even though they're pretending he wasn't doing that. Moreover, where was I? Moreover, because Gorsuch's opinion relies so heavily on false facts, where he did that, in the facts of Kennedy, if the facts of Kennedy actually resembled the made-up facts laid out in Gorsuch's opinion, then Kennedy would have reached the correct result. Even under Lemon, a public school employee is typically permitted to quietly pray while they are not actively engaged with students. Gorsuch's opinion, however, describes a very different case than the one that was actually before the court. And so now they go on to describe, look, you can see the picture right here. The coach is the one holding up the helmet. Now, he's saying, no, I wasn't acting as a coach when I did this. I wasn't acting in my official capacity as a paid employee as I did this. You tell me, based on this picture, what the hell do you think he's doing? Is this just a random schmuck? 5 seconds after the game is over, quietly praying to himself? No. There's a guy leading prayer in his position as a public school employee. That's what this is. Now, they go on to explain the way that everything unfolded. So, basically what happened with this guy is, I think he used to pray. We'll just read it, actually, because I don't remember all the facts, but he used to do it in the locker room or like before the game, and then he was told, look, you can't do that. And then he's trying to find workarounds. Okay. In the real case that was actually before the Supreme Court, Coach Kennedy incorporated motivational prayers into his coaching. Eventually, these prayers matured into public after-game sessions where both Kennedy's players and players on the other team would kneel around Kennedy as he held up helmets from both teams and led students in prayer. After games, Kennedy would also walk out to the 50-yard line where he would kneel and pray in front of students and spectators. Initially, he did so alone, but after a few games, students started joining him. Eventually, a majority of his players did so. One parent complained to the school district that his son felt compelled to participate despite being an atheist because the student feared he, quote, he wouldn't get to play as much if he didn't participate. When the Bremerton School District learned of Kennedy's behavior, it told him to knock it off. Though it did offer to accommodate Kennedy if he wanted to pray when he wasn't surrounded by students and spectators. And Kennedy did end some of his most extravagant behavior, such as the prayer sessions where he held up the helmets while surrounded by kneeling students. So in other words, the things that were so obviously unconstitutional that the school district couldn't stand it, he was like, okay, let me reel that in because clearly I'm crossing the line here where would be repercussions. But he keeps trying to find workarounds to effectively do the same thing. But Kennedy also went on a media tour, presenting himself as a coach who made a commitment with God to outlets ranging from local newspapers to Good Morning America. And Kennedy's lawyer informed the school district that the coach would resume praying at the 50-yard line immediately after the game. Wow. So in other words, he did a public tour, did a PR tour, went on all these shows, basically pretended like he was some sort of hero and he's being oppressed. And then as soon as he saw positive feedback, he was like, oh, I'm just going to go back to doing what I was doing before. Again, you see what's going on here? At the next game following this tour, coaches, players, and members of the public mobbed the field when Kennedy knelt to pray. A federal appeals court described the mob as a stampede, and the school principal said that he saw people fall and that due to the crush of people, the district was unable to keep kids safe. Members of the school's marching band were knocked over by the crowds. And contrary to Gorsuch's repeated claim that Kennedy only wanted to offer a short, private, personal prayer, Kennedy was surrounded by players, reporters, and members of the public when he conducted his prayer session after that game. We know this because Justice Sonia Sotomayor includes a picture of the scene in her dissenting opinion. That's this right here. So, again, he keeps claiming it's a short, private, personal prayer. Does that look short, private, and personal to you? It's not. Look at how Gorsuch responds. Gorsuch dismisses the photographic evidence by claiming that not a single Bremerton student joined Mr. Kennedy's quiet prayers after this game. He claims that the players depicted in the photograph are from the opposing team. When those players are from the Bremerton School District or not, whether those players are from the Bremerton School District or not, that doesn't change the fact that Kennedy engaged in very public prayer sessions and did so while acting as an official representative of a public school. Nor does it change the fact that after he was ordered to cease this activity, Kennedy went on a media tour that seemed designed to turn his supposedly quiet prayers into a public political spectacle, a spectacle that both players and spectators eagerly participated in. Okay. So now they explain how, look, under the real facts of the case, the decision is kind of clear. Here's what they describe Lemon, which is the most important case. The Lemon case, which the court overruled in Kennedy, held that the government's actions must have a secular legislative purpose. Let me repeat that. The government's actions must have a secular legislative purpose. This is not secular. That their, quote, principal or primary effect must be one that neither advances nor inhibits religion. That is the Lemon test right there. And by the way, I think they absolutely nailed it. So in other words, when it comes to questions of religion, the government must be rigidly neutral. Rigidly neutral. Not pro-religion, not anti-religion. Rigidly neutral. So you cannot advance nor inhibit religion. And that's the balancing act, which is why if a teacher wants to privately pray to themselves but not lead the school or the class in prayer, totally fine. If you have a teacher whose religion, makes it so they wear a big-ass cross, totally fine. If you have a Muslim teacher wearing a hijab, totally fine. But what they can't do is basically cross over the line and sort of enforce or force that religion on others, even if it's subtle. Even if it's subtle. And that's exactly what's going on here. So, in other words, look, the argument is what this teacher is doing, or what this coach is doing, is subtly coercive. And we don't want the outright upfront coercion, and we don't want the subtle coercion. We want the government to be ruthlessly neutral on issues of religion. And we want them to not advance nor inhibit religion. So again, if this guy was quietly, on his own volition, going to the 50-yard line and praying by himself, there's no problem with that at all. He could pray to himself before the game if he wants. But when you are clearly trying to do workarounds, clearly trying to make a public spectacle and lead the students in prayer, which is exactly what he was doing, that's not allowed. That's not allowed. Because why should tax money fund a particular religious viewpoint that's being enforced on others where there's subtle coercion going on where students feel forced to join in? That's not okay. So, look, this is the Supreme Court taking a hatchet to separation of church and state. And the problem here is the precedent. Like they said, if you just destroyed the Lemon test, and the Lemon test was perfect. So now what? It's going to be a slow, more and more encroachment of religion in public life. I mean, it's devastating. And again, I think the other case is even more extreme. The one where tax money can now go to private religious schools. What are we talking about? That's clearly a violation of separation of church and state. So, wow. This is not good. This is not good. I was made fun of in 2020 when I said the Supreme Court has entered a new Lochner era. The Lochner era was defined as judicially activist but politically conservative. That's exactly what we're seeing now. Judicially activist, politically conservative. It's already gotten bad with Roe versus Wade. It's gotten bad with a number of cases, and it's just going to get worse. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.